Yo, what's up, man? April 24th, 2025. Welcome to the podcast with Soul. I, Sean Xavier Gumby Sr., the podcast with Soul. Gumby Publishing and the Stigmatism in My Soul. None of us wish to slander, libel, or defame anybody as it relates to this case that we're talking about, which is the United States of America versus Dion Gatlin, the Cuffy case. I'm going to be coming from the Franks hearing dated January 9th, 2017, volume 6, case number 4:14-CR-88. This is out of the Eastern District of Missouri. This is public information. This is a 192-page document. This is Keith Cromer on the stand being cross-examined by the attorney Humphrey. They are still questioning Cromer about the payments to Tammy Cowins at $2,500 a month, and they make specific reference to an instance where they get a special activity report. I guess the DEA gets these things called special activity report, sensitive activity report. And this sensitive activity report makes reference to a tax business that has a bank account where there's over $1 million of money moving through this bank account of this tax business, but there's never no people in the tax business. No customers ever go in, no customers ever go out. There's no activity, there's no people working in there. And what they do, they send agents by there to do drive-bys, even in January and February at the peak of tax season. No activity in the place, yet there's money going in and out of this bank account related to this tax business. So this is a money laundering issue. So what Cromer does is he gets Tammy Cowins. He tells her, look, go in there and see what you can find out. And she goes. And so Humphrey is asking him, like, yo, I thought you only did mid-level to high-level drug trafficking cases. Why are you, did you do this with the tax joint? He's like, yes. And he explains that he had an IRS agent on his team, and that he forwarded the information, and that Tammy Cowins got paid $2,500 a month for doing this, in addition to what she had already been doing, which was supplying information on Cuffy and Suarez. So then they're trying to, I guess these DEA 6s and these DEA 103s that are written by these other agents, these task force officers that operate under Keith Cromer, and then he has to sign off. They're trying to ask that the attorney makes reference that if Task Force Officer David Aguilar says that Tammy Cowins wasn't justified in getting a payment for doing this IRS thing, would he be wrong? And Cromer is like, of course he would, because we told Tammy Cowins, and we had changed the policy in my group that we were no longer going to use informants and cooperators in the traditional sense where you go out and you help us bust somebody and then we pay you then. My new way of doing things, and like what he had always said, he had been doing this before Tammy Cowins with other informants, we're going to pay you a monthly stipend. And it's going to be, that monthly stipend for Tammy Cowins was based on the long-term investigation of the information she was providing to the DEA Atlanta on Cuffy. But they also told her that if nothing was happening with Cuff in terms of anything new, we could use you to do whatever we needed. And in this particular case, there was no new information, yet the investigation of Cuffy was still going on. They used her to go into this tax joint and, put her to work. You understand? This was a part of the work she was going to do. Talked about that. I'm going to get into the paperwork. We're going to read that. Now, in March of 2012, Tammy Cowins is getting nervous. She's afraid of Cuffy, and Keith Cromer decides that he's gonna phase her out, right? Phase her out of the Cuffy investigation, because at this point, St. Louis DEA is actively involved in setting up Cuffy too. And what they do is the way he phrases it as far as phasing her out, meaning that he wouldn't cut her off from all communication with Cuff, right? Because Cuffy and Tammy was already talking to each other anyway. He didn't need to tell her to call, and he says that in here. They already talked anyway. But he would make sure he didn't have her do anything that would get included in the discovery. So when Cuffy's attorneys and Cuffy requested the discovery, she wouldn't be in there. That's what they were trying to do. But she was already concerned about some discovery issues. I think she showed up in some other stuff. Now, this is interesting because phasing her out meant they wouldn't let her pick up money or drug transfers, right? Because doing any of one of those two things would have to go into the discovery. To phase her out, they meant, we're not gonna have you do none of that, right? We're just gonna have you just stay on the phone and keep talking to this nigga and keep talking to Cuff and just keep telling us what he's doing. And this is what she does. Now, they also talk about this. Now, this is around the time, August 2012, this is when the affidavit for the wiretaps is created, and Tammy Cowins is a central piece of that wiretaps for the Title III. Now, and this is interesting, related to another video I just put up. The Title III wiretaps affidavit happens in August of 2012. Keith Cromer explains in here that he initially contacts DEA St. Louis in reference to Fidel, right? In reference to Fidel in St. Louis. And while he's on the phone with the DEA St. Louis regarding Fidel Suarez, he says to DEA St. Louis, hey, this girl that's cooperating for us, this informant, tells us about some dude up in St. Louis named Cuff. And St. Louis DEA antennas go off, bells go off, lights go off. They like, for real? Yeah, we investigating him too. And Cromer says, do you want to speak to her? They say, yeah. And Cromer patches her in on a three-way call with DEA St. Louis. Now, this is the interesting part, because around this time, the special agent in charge of the St. Louis office transfers and becomes the special agent in charge of the Atlanta office right around this time. So, this is pure speculation on my part. This isn't in the paperwork. This is just me, my guesswork. That by this time, if the alleged romantic affair is going on with Tammy Cowins and Keith Cromer, and he patches Tammy Cowins on the phone with DEA St. Louis, and DEA St. Louis begins to talk to Tammy Cowins themselves, it's possible that Tammy Cowins, discloses to DEA St. Louis that she's having this romantic affair with Keith Cromer, allegedly, and they come to the conclusion, DEA St. Louis comes to the conclusion that, really? Well, now we definitely know that we can't let DEA Atlanta and Keith Cromer arrest Cuffy in Atlanta, because of, if this alleged relationship is true, Cuffy's is gonna walk 1,000% when this comes out, that the informant and the DEA agent, in the middle of an active investigation, is found out to be having a romantic affair, allegedly, and she begins to perjure herself on the stand and contradict what she wrote in the affidavit. They couldn't afford that. So eventually, as we know, in 2013, Cuffy, St. Louis, busts Cuffy up in St. Louis, right? And I just thought that was an interesting point, right? That, because remember, Keith Cromer all along in the testimony, he's saying he's going to set Cuffy up in Atlanta with CS1 and CS2 and this other guy named Diego, and they were going to bust him in Atlanta. But St. Louis, I feel, couldn't afford to let that happen. They couldn't afford to, they had to get that case out of Atlanta and get it into St. Louis, and that's what eventually happened, and that's where Cuffy gets busted in St. Louis. So page 70 of 192, Special Agent Swoop received information from a sensitive activity report, a financial document from headquarters related to this business. Tammy Cowins didn't bring this information to us. It was brought to the DEA's attention as far as that business possibly being involved in money laundering. So again, I'm going to qualify this. My group doesn't have any expertise in money laundering. This is talking about that tax business. But because the volume of money in a year's time, we get the records back from the banking system, it shows in excess of well over $1 million going through this account for this business. So what you don't see in here is that agents periodically over time were doing drive-bys by this business, and there's no activity at it. Even through the peak of tax season, there's no activity at this place. So what we did, making a smart decision, we had to have somebody go in there who wouldn't raise any eyebrows or too much suspicion. Since Tammy Cowins was familiar with that area, we sent CS1 to the area. We didn't explain how I'm explaining to you what was going on. The only thing we told them, hey, go into this business and collect whatever intel that you have. So that's why we sent her to that location right there, to identify those people were in there, what you described inside. And from there, sir, I had somebody, a special agent from the Internal Revenue Service, who was assigned to my group, and Special Agent Swoop and her worked together on that. Keith Cromer. Everything I just said was Keith Cromer. This is still Keith Cromer. that just added on other activities that she was doing. She was already going to get paid the $2,500 based upon the activities related to the investigation. This was something totally separate, but we had to document it. So we just added that in there as other activities that they were doing, and we paid them. He's being cross-examined by Humphrey. Because remember, sir, as I explained to you before, if they had new information, they would tell you about it. And in this report right here, she tells you about what happened through the course of going to that business and what happened. So that's all it is. The majority of it, we didn't need to discuss over and over. The same thing over and over again related to Cuff and Fidel. She was doing other things that's not referenced in that report related to the investigation. In this specific report, it's not in here, but it's in other DEA entities as far as things that would document those other things. Not a repetitive report over and over again of the same information. This is something different, but it's a part of Tammy Cowins' cooperation. Attorney Humphrey, you've testified, Mr. Cromer, previously that there was a point where you were attempting to phase out Tammy Cowins out of the investigation in regards to Cuff, Dion Gatlin. Keith Cromer, yes, sir. Humphrey, and that occurred because of safety concerns. Is that a fair assessment? Keith Cromer, safety concerns and discovery issues. Yes, sir. Okay, Humphrey, and that would have been following the discussions with the DEA St. Louis on August the 5th, 2012. Keith Cromer, no, sir. That started in March of 2012. So there were safety concerns going back to March of 2012, Attorney Humphrey. Yes, sir. Attorney Humphrey, but certainly by the time there was the wiretap affidavit that was granted here in St. Louis, that DEA St. Louis did the communication with you and Tammy Cowins. At that point, there was a necessity to get Tammy Cowins out of the Gatling Cuffy matter. Keith Cromer, I'll answer that and say yes, because of the safety concerns, because Tammy Cowins knew Cuffy personally, and they had safety concerns over it. But they weighed their options. It was their option to do that, Tammy Cowins. And Tammy Cowins made the decision to cooperate, continue to cooperate with the government because she had a financial incentive to do it. Attorney Humphrey, okay, so despite her being phased out, in your estimation, she continued to provide information. Keith Cromer, yes. And what it is, so you'll know when I mean phased out, I mean being involved in anything that would generate any criminal activity, discussions and things. Or we were never going to put them in a position to make a buy or transfer of drugs or transfer of money, because those things are discovery issues. What it is, if they provided good, actionable intelligence related to them, that was the importance of it. And that's what we did, and we structured it in a way to make that happen. Humphrey, in August of 2012, Tammy Cowins still had access to Dion Gatlin, Cuffy? Keith Cromer, of course. Humphrey, and was she still in regular communication with Cuffy at your request? Keith Cromer, no. That's just the natural. That's the natural relationship. They were in contact with one another. I didn't have to tell Tammy to talk to Cuffy or not. They communicated with one another anyway. Hold on, y'all, my paper falling down. Humphrey, and so it's your opinion that as of August 2012, Tammy Cowins was still a viable confidential source in relation to the activity of Dion Gatlin or Cuffy, Keith Cromer. That's a fact, not my opinion. Humphrey, okay, let me ask you this. So at the time when you were having discussions with DEA St. Louis, did you relate to them that Tammy Cowins still had contact with Cuffy and was a viable source of information? Keith Cromer, yes, I let DEA St. Louis speak to her. Humphrey, okay, and so you provided them with that information. They created their affidavit, and that was on them to use the information that you provided to them concerning CS1 and her continued viability as far as being a confidential source in relation to Cuffy. Keith Cromer, first of all, I didn't. Tammy Cowins provided them with the information themselves. It's important how that, so you'll understand how the conversation initially happened. From the beginning, you have to understand this, sir. Tammy Cowins initially gave the information. She gave the agents the information first in Atlanta. I eventually wound up receiving the same information, and we entered it into the DEA database. That's important. The only thing that came back was Fidel. You forward months later to eventually, we got a contact with DEA St. Louis, and it wasn't because of Cuffy. It was because of Fidel. And at that time, I told the agents, I told the supervisor, and I think it was one or maybe two of the case agents. We talked to them initially about Fidel and how I explained to them about the Los Angeles connection and gave them the number to the DEA agent in LA so they can speak with him. And I said, by the way, we have an informant, Tammy Cowins, who told us about this guy who was over in your area, and they call him Cuff. And at that point, those agents and that supervisor, the light clicked on, and they told me, hey, we know about Cuff. We are looking at Cuff. At that point, I said, beautiful. I said, would you like to speak to Tammy Cowins, who gave us the information? DEA St. Louis said yes, and I patched Tammy Cowins on a conference call so the agents in St. Louis could speak to Tammy Cowins themselves, and that's what happened. Peace.